This video is sponsored by StartPlaying.Games, tabletop RPGs run by professional game masters. Eventually, you get to a point as a DM where you have an idea for a homebrew adventure or you just ran one that was just so cool and so much fun, you just have to share it. It's the natural extension of homebrewing magic items, custom monsters, and new character options. But when you decide to graduate onto adventure writing, you're taking on a whole new beast. In my opinion, it's the most difficult of all RPG content creation. Now, there is a school of thought propagated by a certain D&D YouTuber with much better hair than I that says you shouldn't write adventures. With 40 years of the game's history, there are so many already written that a DM can run a new one every single week and never run out. Why bother? But that's kind of missing the point. Why make new movies, compose new music, or write new books? Tastes change with time, and we want adventures to be relevant to the zeitgeist. And as consumers of media, which DMs reading published adventures are, we crave novelty, so the mere fact that something is new makes it more interesting to us. But I'm going to go one step further. Creating and sharing content with each other is what helps form a community. In that light, homebrewing adventures is essential for having a thriving tabletop RPG ecosystem, where we can all play more and better games. So this is the video for when you decide to write an adventure for someone other than yourself. I'm going to show you what I think separates a good adventure from one that's pretty much unpublishable. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I've been editing and playtesting 2 adventures that I commissioned to be written for Galder's Gazetteer. But more on those at the end of the video. In spite of the title at the bottom of the screen, this is not the adventure design video. In fact, there probably won't be an adventure design video because it's too broad a topic for one single vid. That's why I have a whole playlist for adventure design, and even more on my $1 Patreon. But still, I'm going to be referencing these concepts in the rest of the video, so here is a very brief rundown of what I think are the essential elements of a good adventure. Any adventure essentially needs 3 things. An interesting premise. This is the seed of the quest or the scenario the heroes are facing. Whether it's a rescue mission, a heist, a raid, or some other twist on a classic trope, the premise of the adventure needs to be about the present moment, and it should matter. The heroes need to be able to impact the here and now. A cool location. You obviously need a place where the adventure happens. I mean, I guess you could have the adventure happen in a void. Classically, the location is a dungeon, but it could also be a cavern, a palace, or something really out there, the belly of a giant fish or an alien spaceship. And 3, you need a memorable villain. The best antagonists not only provide meaningful opposition and a real threat, but they do so in a way that is novel or unexpected. Not all villains need to be these complex, sympathetic entities, but they all need to have a logical goal that can't be prevented through the player's actions, even if it's as simple as stopping the monsters from eating the livestock. And there's no need to restrict yourself to a singular villain. Your antagonist could be a boss and its minions, a group of monsters, or a motley crew. But whatever form they take, putting your own unique twist on it is something that can really make your adventure memorable. Now, in some adventures, one of these elements will shine more than others. Event-based adventures where a series of scenes unfold in a sequence or a branching path is obviously more focused on the premise and plotting to be successful. Location-based adventures are essentially self-contained areas where the story unfolds only as the heroes explore. And monster-centered adventures are driven by the lore and behavior of a particular foe. But in reality, most published modules don't fall squarely into one of these categories. The dungeon, of course, can have a programmed event, or the main opposition can really come from environmental hazards, etc., etc. But still, when writing or editing an adventure, I still think it's really useful to think about which of these elements is taking the lead and which ones are playing support. The last thing I'm going to mention about adventure design is perhaps the most important. The players have to be able to impact the outcomes. A written adventure must allow the player's actions to control the result, and not rely solely on preset conclusions. Just like when DMing, you're not writing a fantasy novel when publishing an adventure. At some point, it must be clear to the DM reading the adventure what choices the PCs can make that are going to have a meaningful impact on how the story unfolds. The biggest difference between designing a quest for your players to go on as a home DM and writing an adventure that you want other people to run is you don't know who you're writing the adventure for. As an adventure writer, you are agnostic with regards to both the players and the characters. In order to ensure that most of your potential players are happy, at a very basic level, you need to make sure that your adventure contains a bit of something to make every player type happy. Something to roleplay, something to smash, or you need to be deliberate and tell that DM this is a combat-heavy module or more of a murder mystery with a fantasy setting, so that DM will know whether or not their group and players will like it. As for the characters, this is really the central dilemma of adventure writing. How do you write a story when you don't know who the protagonists are? You don't know the party's compositions or dynamics or bonds, or necessarily what drives them as characters, which can be a problem when you're writing adventures because you need something to get the heroes to go on the adventure that you've written. When inserting an adventure into your home campaign, you kind of know the motivations of your player characters, but for adventures written for other tables, this means that the bait has to appeal to wide swaths of characters. Typically, there are two ways of doing this. Either the hero's goal is so widely applicable, save the world, get the gold, kill the monster, or you'll have lots and lots of different hooks in an attempt to strike a chord with enough of the group to generally go along with the plan. The problem is there are only a few broad goals, so those quickly run out of novelty, and having to have several separate goals can quickly lead to a convoluted and confusing plot. The solution that I think works best is to have one broad goal and then layer it with lots of easy to imagine tie-ins. For example, you can rescue the princess, who is also the priest of a friendly temple and being held by a rival gang in an abandoned ancestral tomb. For all of its faults, Horde of the Dragon Queen actually does this really well. There's a broad goal, get the gold, but it also has lots of layers to it. It'll thwart an evil cult, it was stolen from a potential ally, you're protecting your home from doom, etc. It's casting a wide net to give motivation to as many characters as possible to go do something. Which brings us to the next part, the verbs, the doing, the going on of the adventure. The best adventures are driven by the player's actions. So your adventure needs to provide a strong sense of what exactly it is they need to do. The verbs attached to the quest are the actions that the characters are going to take in order to achieve their goals. They need to be explicit enough so the players know whether or not they've done it. There is a world of difference between not knowing what's best to do next and not knowing what you're supposed to do next. One is peak D&D and the other is a problem. The DM is going to be relying on the adventure to provide the imperatives to the characters. And if ever the DM feels like they're not sure what actions the characters need to take to progress the story, you've failed them as an adventure writer. So whatever verbs you put in your adventure need to get through two levels, from the adventure to the DM, and then from the DM to the player. And dealing with that multi-level communication and overcoming the friction inherent in it is part of adventure writing I call soundness. And that's what we're going to go over in the next part of the video. You may have heard the adage that no DM's plan survives contact with the players. Well, I'm going to tell you, if you're going to be writing adventures for others, you don't have the luxury of just waving your hand and saying, oh, improvise. Your adventure has to have the flexibility to account for the players wanting to do unexpected things and straying off the beaten path. And it has to give the DM tools to guide the players back on track if they go on a wild goose chase. Because all the potential player actions can't be known, you have to write structures and elements into your adventure that can withstand a lot of different possibilities. This means you can't write adventures that rely on players taking a particular course of action in order for them to play out. If you ever write, when the characters ... you've made a mistake. If an encounter has to be solved in a certain way, kill the monster, find the key, or the plot can't move forward, not only does that feel really unrealistic and unrewarding, but in addition, the players will go to great lengths just to sort of prove that adventure and the hapless DM wrong. Players really demand agency. So the best way to really player-proof an adventure is to bake in lots of clear choices. If your adventure consciously creates scenarios where there are a couple of things the players can see they could do, that usually satisfies the urge the players have to impact what's going to happen. Even if, especially if, they can make the wrong choice without everything becoming unraveled. If you don't plan in a structure that encourages the players to make an impact, they will find a way to have one anyway. And that is what tends to break adventures. The related issue is you can't rely on the dice to make the adventure work for you. You can't gate the plot behind an ability check the characters can fail, and it has to be able to withstand things like the boss taking a couple of unexpected critical hits, and still to deliver a satisfying ending. You need to be able to account for the other than predicted outcomes. So your written adventure needs to survive contact with the players. But not only that, it needs to survive contact with the DM that's reading it. You have to account for the fact that the DM running the adventure isn't you. That DM doesn't know your thought process. They don't have all the insight that went into crafting every single line of text. In fact, it's very likely that the DM running your adventure just skimmed through it. Can your adventure survive the DM misremembering or not even reading a line of text? What happens if that DM focuses on the wrong details or forgets to give an important clue? How to make sure the DM gets the most important information most relies on how the adventure is presented. I can't think of a better way to say this than Mike Shea already has. The DM is your audience. You need to keep their needs at the center of your writing. Fundamentally, your written adventure needs to do two interrelated things. It needs to make the DM reading it excited to run the adventure, and needs to give them the information they need to run it. When you're making an adventure that's going to be read, something that you expect someone else to give their time to, it's gotta be worth it. It has to be entertaining. Like anything else they read for pleasure, each line of text has to make them want to read the next. So it's kind of a good idea to put in little jokes or Easter eggs to make it enjoyable for the DM reading it. But the most important thing is to make the DM think they'll have a good time running it. Something that sparks their imagination or makes them say, I can't wait to get this in front of my players. If you get the DM intrigued by introducing an unexpected twist on a trope or providing a concept that really gets them amped, that will get them excited. And that excitement gets picked up by the players who are then more likely to go along. Your written adventure also needs to help the DM understand what's fully going on in any situation. Your goal should be to organize all the information in the most intuitive way, to ease the burden on the DM running it. This means not burying critical information in the middle of a wall of text. Rather, you should repeat key points and details in different places, reinforcing that structure of your adventure. It also means presenting information in order for the DM to have the most context. For example, make sure that a location is properly described and introduced to the DM before having an NPC randomly mention it in a box text. Put all of the NPC's motivations and knowledge in one place. You're not trying to keep the DM in suspense, you're trying to give them the clearest picture of what's going on in any situation. Something else you should also be conscientious of for the DM reading the adventure is the tension between detail and distraction. For the sake of soundness, an adventure should strive to transfer the most important information as concisely as possible. But at the same time, details like NPC mannerisms, dungeon dressing, building features, and treasure items are what help bring about a sense of immersion. They create the illusion of depth necessary to spark belief in the fictional world. And crucially, that sort of fluff is what helps the DM be an effective narrator. A good rule of thumb is to present detail only as a flourish and only when it will either spark the imagination of the DM or make something that the players will take note of. A final bit of advice if you want to present your adventures well, and this might seem obvious, is to read published adventures. Not to just be inspired by the classic modules, but to deconstruct them and really understand what an adventure is. Performing a critical analysis of why you like an adventure is going to be a lot more useful than just a list of things you find cool. Novelists read great books, screenwriters watch great movies, and if you want to publish D&D adventures, digging into what has already been published is going to help you learn essential techniques. The more you analyze popular D&D modules, the easier it's going to be for you to write widely appealing adventures of your own. Yeah, that's it. That's the video, folks. Hopefully you found it useful. I really wish something like this had been around when I was trying to do the editing for the Galder's adventures. Speaking of the Galder adventure, I am going to run one of them on stream, hopefully for one of you viewers. All you have to do is leave a comment in this video with !adventure, and then I'll get back to you once I randomly select the winners. We'll be using the platform of this video's sponsor, startplaying.games. It's an easy marketplace for players and DMs to get together and start playing RPGs right away. DMs can advertise games on any platform, and players can search for free or paid games. It's a super easy option to get started playing right away. The folks who end up playing with me on stream, I hope they're going to use the material from Galder's Gazetteer. The new playtest is in the description, including the Blood Sage Barbarian, the Defender and Dragoon Fighters, and Circle of the Tide Druid. And finally, if you like this video, please consider joining my $1 Patreon. For just $1, you get access to everything I do, including dozens of streams, live play, and all sorts of fun stuff in my home game. As always, like, subscribe, and if you have some thoughts about what makes good adventure writing, be sure to let me know in the comments below.